It's almost hard to imagine that the flow of people and the exchange of goods between the Iberian Peninsula and the Americas has never ceased since 1492. In school, we learn very little about the events around Christopher Columbus's journey to the New World, and we learn much less about the Spaniards who joined him. Since that expedition never reached Mexico, the connection between us and them is not readily apparent. But for many Mexicans, tracing your ancestry back to Spain oftentimes cuts right through the Caribbean. The Caribbean islands are also a key part of the story of the conquest of Mexico. In 1453, the Islamic Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople, the most formidable Christian capital on the eastern edge of Europe, bringing an end to the Byzantine Empire and ushering in the close of the medieval period. The fall of the East exposed Western Europe to new dangers. Perhaps even more dire was the fact that it cut off Christian Europe from important trade routes into Asia and to the Middle East. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the success of the Iberian Catholic armies led by Castilla and Aragon in pushing back Muslims further and further south offered new hope to the Vatican and neighboring Christian kingdoms. As success was surely on the horizon, Castilla was already formulating plans to chart the oceans beyond its borders. And why wouldn't they? Neighboring Portugal was already experimenting with funding expeditions in the Atlantic. In 1476, a man believed to be from Genoa, which is located in modern-day Italy, shipwrecked off the coast of Portugal. While in the country, Christopher Columbus found his way into elite circles, and by the following year, he was navigating ships on behalf of the Portuguese, sailing as far away as Iceland. In 1486, after being rejected by the King of Portugal, Columbus met for the first time with authorities in Spain and presented them with the proposal to sail across the Atlantic Ocean all the way to Asia. The idea was appealing, and within just 4 months of defeating the Moors, Castilla eagerly signed an agreement which offered Columbus particularly favorable terms, even by the standards of the times. In exchange for his services, Castilla offered Columbus the position of viceroy. A viceroy is someone who governs a jurisdiction as a representative of a king or a queen. This type of jurisdiction is known as a viceroyalty. In his first trip to the Americas, Columbus reached the Bahamas, Cuba, and Hispaniola, where he established the Colombian viceroyalty, which was the very first legal jurisdiction of this kind in the New World. This same governing model was used to establish the viceroyalties of New Spain, Peru, New Granada, and Rio de la Plata, once those lands were conquered. The Spanish government also agreed to fund 90% of the cost of the expedition. This might have been too high a price to pay for Portugal, which likely explains why they declined his proposal. Columbus's governing style was considered to be tyrannical, even in his own time. On the island of Hispaniola where he governed, extreme working conditions, food disruptions, and disease decimated the native population, and Spaniards who rebelled or spoke out against Columbus's poor leadership were executed. Ultimately, the Genoese explorer was arrested, sent back to Spain, and stripped of his governing responsibilities. It was around this time that an 18-year-old Hernán Cortés arrived in Hispaniola. Having studied law at the University of Salamanca, he could read and write during an era in which most Spaniards were illiterate. And now that the glorious wars against the Moors on the peninsula were over, the Americas offered a new avenue for a young man to attain upward social mobility. At the time, there were perhaps less than 2,000 Spaniards in the New World. By this time, the Crown of Castilla had gotten much more serious about creating an orderly society, as the scarce resources and false expectations raised tension in the region. Cortés arrived not to the paradise he had expected, but instead, he came to a society in ruins, a place where unruly settlers failed to establish meaningful relations with the native inhabitants. It was at this time that a new governor was appointed, and he arrived with supplies, religious leaders, experts in agriculture, livestock, and other items necessary for recreating Spanish life in the Americas. This next phase of colonization was also when Spanish women began permanently moving to settlements in the Caribbean. Cortés was a young man with no actual combat experience. He might have had some training in firearms and swordsmanship, and he certainly knew how to ride a horse. But like many men of his generation, he hadn't actually been on a battlefield. But at 20 years old, he was appointed to pacify Hispaniola in order to get the situation under control. Given these circumstances, a complete mess created by a wave of settlers before him, he likely came to realize that his training in the art of negotiations could have avoided the complete chaos generated by unmitigated brute force. In 1511, an opportunity to move up was presented to Cortés when he was offered the position of head of military operations to conquer Cuba, but he declined. Instead, Cortés later convinced the newly established governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, to appoint him as treasurer, a request the governor granted. This role put Cortés in a position to get to know the most important people making their way to the Caribbean.